Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. Snow Elf. In the middle of the snowstorm that blanketed the empty roads of an American western town, there was no sound except for the snow tapping against the windows and the bitter wind howling between the buildings. The distance between the buildings seemed unreal, like a sinister barrier separating the living from the dead. Leah, a small town on the far west, had long been abandoned. But traces of past life still remained, the remnants of people whom the ominous shadow of snow had swept away on its path. At the heart of the town stood an old hospital, once the pride of local medicine, but now a mere somber shadow of the past. The hospital had long ceased its operations, and in its corridors, only the breath of time could be heard in the silence. But in the underground rooms, behind locked doors, there was a laboratory space where horrific experiments continued even after the other parts of the hospital had fallen into disrepair. This place became a symbol of unusual and incredibly terrifying events that could never be included in history textbooks. It all started with a project initiated long ago, in the mid-20th century. Scientists attempted to create a new type of human, one that would be more resilient to the harsh winter conditions, to snowstorms, and to the growing cold with each passing year. So, they began experiments, using the DNA of humans and various animals, as well as numerous chemical and physical substances. All the experiments were declared secret, and only a few chosen ones knew what was really happening behind the closed doors of the laboratory. They created a creature, initially named the Snow Elf. It was small, with white, almost translucent skin, incredibly resilient and delicate. However, its mind was foggy, and its body still underwent mutations, changing with every new experiment. Over time, the elf began to grow increasingly aggressive. The doctors and scientists didn't know how to stop its growing rage. They tried to kill it using different methods, but each time it came back stronger. As a result, the snow elf became not just the outcome of the experiments, it became their nightmare, haunting every person who had been involved in these dreadful scientific studies. They decided to lock it in the underground cells of the hospital. But even in captivity, the snow elf continued its torment. It dreamed of revenge. And although people tried to lock it behind iron doors, it seemed that the very essence of this monster longed for freedom. However, as the years passed, the consequences of the experiments grew more terrifying. Those who had been in the laboratory began to disappear. First it was the technical staff, then the nurses, and even the doctors. Then, one day, after several months of silence, with no news coming from the hospital, a new generation of scientists set off to Leah to find out what had happened to their predecessors. They arrived at the empty hospital, where everything was locked. Only deep, foggy feelings of fear filled the rooms. The snow lying on the roof didn't melt, and everything in this town was covered with a thick layer of cold. In the hospital's basement, they found records that revealed the secrets of the snow elf. It turned out that it had not been created just for the sake of it, but with the goal of controlling death. However, over time, this experiment became a complete catastrophe. One evening, during another snowstorm, when they were almost done with their search, something terrible happened. The creature broke free from its cell. The basement doors were opened, and the snow elf was free. The scientists who tried to escape were dead, everyone who entered this bloody labyrinth. The snow elf, like a ghost, followed them every step of the way. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, and its eyes, soulless windows to a dark abyss. Those who survived told that it was everywhere, in the darkness of the basement, in the shattered mirrors of the hospital, in the cracks of the walls. But the scariest thing was that it didn't just follow them. It stole their souls, turning them into its subordinates, who then became part of its fierce winter kingdom. The snow elf was no longer just the result of experiments. It was the creation of malicious science, and now, it hunted everyone who had ever tried to peer into that dark abyss where this story began. Now, when snow once again falls upon the town, and the storm sweeps away all traces, Only one thought remains in the hearts of those who survived. No one will return, and the snow elf will begin its hunt once again. The hospital stood abandoned, left by the world, but nothing was forgotten. The snow elf left its traces in every corner of this place. And although only a few old buildings remained in the town, here and there, one could still find worn-out walls, dusty windows, and invisible shadows that watched every movement again and again. Those who tried to look into Lisa again only heard of it in dreadful stories. No one returned from there alive. After many years, the locals began to forget about the hospital and the snow elf. But every winter, when the snow fell especially heavily, new terrifying stories would emerge. People who traveled through the forest spoke of strange sounds that could be heard from deep within the woods, even when the wind died down. They spoke of paths that became forgotten in just a few hours, of footprints found in the forest, which only one creature could have left: the snow elf. But there was something even more terrifying than any story about frozen souls and memories of the past. It was a new form of mutants that began to appear in the surrounding areas. People who drank from the rivers where the scientists once conducted their experiments began to lose their human appearance. They transformed into beings with the same traits as the snow elf: pale skin, transparent eyes, a gaunt posture, and most chilling of all, soulless, ominous longing for death. But the most terrifying event occurred during one of the harsh winters. The path to Lisa began to be enveloped in a mysterious fog. People who set out for the town began to disappear without a trace. All those who tried to approach the hospital felt how the cold gradually crept up on them, as though the snow itself was sliding over their bodies, penetrating their skin, draining their life force. And so, one of the last visitors, a young scientist who ventured there to uncover the secrets of the experiments, found himself in the very epicenter of this horror. During his time in Lisa, he found the old laboratories, still operational even after decades of neglect. A few mad scientists who survived from the time of the experiments were still working there. They tried to control the snow elf using some unknown force. It was not just a monster. It was part of a massive, sinister machine that kept working even after all its creators had long been dead. The elf had truly become more than just a creature. It had become part of the laboratory, living by its own rules. And so, during another experiment, when these scientists attempted to control the elf once more using chemical reactions, something went terribly wrong. They not only freed the snow elf but endowed it with new abilities. Now it was nearly invulnerable to any attacks. Its body became even more like frozen ice, and it began transforming the surrounding world into a frozen wasteland. When the scientists realized they could no longer control their horrific creation, the snow elf escaped the laboratory. And thus began a new phase of its terrifying evolution. It no longer needed human souls for its power. It had become a cold, merciless monster, turning everything around it into icy ruins. People began to notice that it appeared in those places where snow usually fell. The creature killed everything in its path, erasing traces of life and turning them into icy monuments to death. And now, with winter returning, one of the few who remained in Lisa found new records in the old archives. He learned that the snow elf was no longer just the result of an experiment. It was the experiment, created to destroy humanity, resulting in an evil force that was unstoppable. In his final realization, the scientist began to understand that no attempts to stop the snow elf would ever make sense. Now, its creation had become the very essence of winter. It was the eternal cold that would always remain in Lisa, sending anyone who dared to approach to the dark abyss, a place where death would come not only in the snowdrifts but in the very shadow of night. Winter had arrived once again, and the town of Lisa had been forgotten by all who did not know its dark secret. However, for those who dared to approach the abandoned town, this winter was deadly dangerous. The rumors of the snow elf had not ceased. The forest surrounding the town had once again become a place of deadly adventures. The light blanket of snow falling to the ground seemed no longer as innocent as before. It was a signal. Once again, just as many years ago, the snow elf was beginning its hunt. No one knew how long it had been free. Had it lived among these snowy forests for thousands of years, or only for a few decades? All the sounds of nature seemed foreign to it. It was part of winter, its ominous shadow that everyone feared, even without understanding why. It did not just pursue, it killed both body and soul. This time, the snow elf did not just exterminate people. It consumed the town, becoming an inseparable part of it. Lisa had been its home, but now it was its killer. Traces of its presence could be felt in every crack in the walls, in every cold wind that howled through the empty streets. The town, once vibrant and alive, had become a frozen wasteland, filled with fear and terrible memories. But even deep within the forest, new adventurers appeared. Scientists who had heard the old stories, yet did not believe in them, still ventured to that place. Among them was Dr. Markson, a university researcher who specialized in myths and ancient creatures. He had heard tales of the snow elf, but he never imagined the force and darkness he would face. Markson and his team were well prepared, with all the modern technology that would help them survive in such conditions. They brought thermal imagers, compasses, even old maps that showed the locations of unexplained disappearances. But all of this was in vain. The moment they entered the forest, they realized they had walked into a trap. All the paths they planned to take became blocked. Snowstorms grew stronger, and even their best compasses began to go haywire. The wind sounded like a whisper that penetrated their souls, making them feel a fear that came from within. And the deeper they ventured into the forest, the clearer it became. This was not just a forest, it was a place where a merciless monster lived. One of the women in the team, Catherine, told how she had seen something strange. She had no words for it, but she clearly felt its presence. Something very old, beyond human understanding. It was something without a human face, only two red fiery eyes that gleamed from the darkness as she walked across the snow's surface. And when she asked the others, they just stared at her with empty eyes, as if they were no longer human, but mere parts of this terrifying world. They began to fall behind each other, slowly fading away like snow melting under the sun. And when they were all finally lost, it became impossible to tell who was alive and who had long been dead, as the snow elf had turned each one into part of its memories. It took them into its icy labyrinth, leaving only shadows of their bodies among the snowdrifts. The forest became a place where time had no power, where the dead could not die. Dr. Markson, the only one left alive, endured the greatest suffering. The snow elf decided to leave him behind, trying to make him understand. Death was impossible. It transported its enemy into the darkness, where everything began, and where nothing changed. Where there was no hope of salvation. The doctor fell to his knees, gazing at the dark forest, which was transforming into a living nightmare. "You cannot escape what I will do to you," the snow elf's voice echoed, tearing through the silence. And then the doctor understood. The horror he had tried to escape was the very essence of this land. He was part of it. He could not leave this place, could not forget what he had seen. And the snow elf was his final trial. Markson forgot everything. And when winter returned, new people heard the stories that the snow elf was still alive. And it was waiting. Waiting for those who would seek to uncover its secrets. But for this bravery, they would pay with their bodies frozen in the snow. When Markson woke up after the snow elf had left him on the edge of its domain, he felt the cold penetrate to the very core of his body. His body refused to move, but he had no choice. He was not simply alive, he was forgotten, bound to this place where everything had died, but still lived at the same time. He felt every gust of wind, every sound of snow falling from the sky, like an invisible hand pressing down on his heart. Markson tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't obey. He began to realize that he wasn't just freezing. His body was becoming part of this place, as if it had been cursed. The snow elf was not only dead and dangerous, it was part of nature, and now the doctor had become part of its horrific world. Meanwhile, in the town of Lisa, truly forgotten, new rumors began to spread. People who dared pass near the forest noticed strange figures in the distance. Pale, shadow-like beings gliding across the snow. But as they got closer, these figures would vanish, leaving only a sense of fear and a coldness that lingered in the air. Sometimes, even on the coldest nights, one could hear the cries of children, but they were not cries of the living. It was something else. Groups of people who ventured into the town seeking answers also disappeared. They returned, but not as they were. Once, a group of researchers who had ventured to the forest came back, but those who were still alive could never explain what had happened to them. Their eyes were empty, as though they had lost part of themselves. They walked through the town, but they no longer spoke. Their movements became mechanical, as if controlled by someone else. And in the forest itself, time had stopped, as if the ages stretched into infinity. Everything seemed like a dream, where every step created new and new nightmares. One of the last witnesses of this world, who had tried to escape, saw the forest and realized he had fallen into a trap he could not avoid. The winds whispered his name, but not as a simple word. It was a name long forgotten by his ancestors, but one that now belonged to him. It was a hint that everything was part of a circle, from which there was no escape. With every step, they sank deeper into the grasp of this place. And they began to hear something new, sounds that seemed to come from the depths. They sounded like a distant bell, but it was not ordinary. This bell tore through the silence and brought only death. And it was the bell that pointed to the snow elf. The long walls of the hospital, standing on the border of this terrifying world, began to bend and crack. They grew colder and began to feel alive. The cold didn't just linger. It was. And through these walls, the relentless footsteps of the elf passed once again. They did not just pursue, they destroyed. They turned human souls into voids. This was not just a place of death. It was the perfect world for the elf itself. It was eternal. Its skin was more than just white ice. It was a white world with no boundaries. And anyone who stepped onto its territory became part of this world. The creation of the elf synchronized with it, and with those who hopelessly tried to flee but could not. If Markson could still think, he began to feel his own memories fading, disappearing. Something was changing inside him. His body became part of this dreadful cold, as did his soul. And then, in one moment of absolute silence, Markson realized that he was no longer just a man. He had become part of the snow elf's kingdom. He had become its memory, and he was no longer capable of escaping. Now he served it, just like all the others who had failed to leave this forgotten world. And when the next winter came, the town of Leah was once again consumed by the dark shadow. Stories about the snow elf continued to circulate, becoming part of myths and terrifying tales. And even if you were wise and tried to escape this place, you never knew. It was only the beginning of the end. You were already part of this horrifying world that seemed to have no end. When Markson disappeared into the forest, just like all those who had tried to penetrate its curse, the myth of the snow elf became even more ominous. People who had heard of this forest and its embodiment of cold grew so cautious that even the word Lisa was spoken with trepidation. No one dared to venture deep into this cursed place. They only whispered about how it came alive in the dark, how the forest slowly devoured souls, leaving only tracks in the snow. But, as it often happens, over time fear weakens. And so, one group of young people, eager for adventure and answers, decided to test the rumors. They had heard that the town of Leah was never fully abandoned, that there were still remnants of people hiding in the depths of the forest. They didn't know that their bravery would lead them to the worst nightmare. At first, everything seemed ordinary. They walked through the dense forest, where ancient trees pressed close to each other, blocking the sunlight. Only occasionally did small rays of light break through the snow clouds, like burning eyes watching them from a distance. But the farther they walked, the colder the air became. And not just cold, it became heavy, like a frightened silence. None of them could understand why the temperature dropped with every step, and their hearts began to beat faster. No one noticed when they reached the edge of Leah, which now looked like a ghost, frozen in time. The buildings, once inhabited, now appeared as empty skeletons, soulless and dead, yet their eyes, countless broken windows, seemed to watch them. Each of them began to feel fear, though none could explain why. Only one of the group, named Jacob, spoke up. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't just an old town. This is something else. This place won't let us leave alive." But they had already gone too far. No one heard his warning. Everyone wanted to prove their courage, to overcome what others feared. They didn't know that an invisible gaze was already watching them. Something old, dark, that had existed here long before them, and which still lingered in this place, even after it had been forgotten. Meanwhile, the snow elf itself felt empowered. Like all monsters, it lived through fear and pain. But this time, it had a more important goal than simply chasing and destroying. It intended to awaken old experiments to regain the power it had lost. It began searching for new souls to add to its chilling dominion. The group found themselves in the center of the town. They stood before an old hospital, now resembling a face in the window, long forgotten. Yet something remained in the shadows, not just sounds or fragments of memories. It was something they couldn't imagine. As they got closer to the hospital's doors, the air grew colder, almost icy. Their breaths, breaking from their mouths, left behind white clouds, as though every movement was thawing a piece of the cold shadow. Finally, one of them, Amelia, approached the door first and touched the handle. She felt her hand begin to freeze. And then, for a moment, she heard a whisper that reached her ear, like a cold breath passing through every nerve in her body. From that voice, it became clear that this was not just the wind. It was the voice of the snow elf. "You've entered my world, now stay here forever," the chilling whisper echoed. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was not just the elf. It was its shadow, now part of this horrific place, as if it were the very embodiment of fear turned physical. And when Jacob confronted the figure, he realized that the snow elf had long since ceased to need a body. It embodied death itself, slowly consuming everything around it. The group tried to flee, but it was in vain. Jacob's body began to crumble like ice. All those who remained became part of what awaited anyone who dared to enter this world. They began to break apart into pieces, as if freezing, turning into small shards of ice that quickly fell, scattering the snow around them. The snow elf had won. No one could escape from this curse, which was much older than any story they had heard. The snow elf was not just a monster or a being, it was the end. And when winter came again, the town of Leah remained empty, with only the snow elf left among the shadows of this frozen world. In the depths of the forest, nothing moved except for it. Its eternal cold, which no longer sought victims but simply waited for them, knowing they would come. And they would never be able to leave. Time in the forest stood still, and when winter came again, those who had not yet encountered this entity began to hear new sounds. Not just the rustling of snow or the wind, but merciless screams coming from the very heart of the forest. These screams tore through the silence, striking fear into anyone who approached the place where the last travelers had perished. However, over time, even these terrifying sounds became familiar. People living nearby no longer dared to venture into the forest, even in the daylight, knowing that anyone who dared would become part of this dark world. Yet, even in the nearby villages, strange events began to unfold. At first, they thought it was just the effect of what had happened in the forest, but eventually, they realized that the snow elf, this terrifying myth, was not confined only to the town of Leah tonight. Those who had never returned appeared. People began to disappear. At first, it was just a few missing persons, whom no one could find. But then the disappearances became widespread. All of them went into the forest and never came back. Some saw them in the darkness. They walked, filled with emptiness, and their eyes were unnaturally white, as if devoid of life. Their movements were mechanical, their bodies frozen. One day, in the middle of winter, when the snow covered the ground in a thick layer, one of the local elders, who had lived in the village all his life, decided to tell his story. He had seen how it all began. He was young when his father, along with other villagers, went into the forest to investigate the mystery that had been terrorizing the town. They did not believe that magic was connected to the town and the forest. They thought it was just old myths that had no substance beyond fear and stories. They never suspected that the snow elf was an entity created as a result of cruel experiments. The hospital that stood at the center of Leah was not just a hospital. It was a place where people who had died from hunger and disease became living shadows. Their souls were consumed by the cold, and they became part of what later became the elf, an entity intertwined with the very horrors of this world. We don't know how it happened, but we understood that it would never leave us, the elder said. Now, we've become part of it, just like our parents. We are no longer just people. We are shadows. Shadows that were once people, and now we just wait for our turn. His words echoed like a curse, and the terror from what he had said enveloped the entire town. How was this possible? How could it have happened that the snow elf had become more than just a legend, but a real nightmare, awakened and spreading death and cold around itself? Year after year, the myth came to life, and with it, more people began to understand. The snow elf was not confined to the forest, it was part of this world. Its power permeated the shadows, filling every emptiness it could. And it was not just waiting to attack victims. It had already become part of everyone who had died in the forest. They had become a part of it. It had the power to move like a shadow, like a memory of death that lived in everyone. The town of Leah had become a place without a measure of time. People came and went, and their memories of the forest grew fainter, their souls beginning to freeze. It was an immortal chain with no beginning or end. The snow elf was not just a physical entity, it was in every reflection, in every cold shadow. And with each year, as winter once again covered the land, it grew stronger. Then, one day, amid the snowdrifts, a new figure appeared. It resembled a person, but its face was covered in ice cracks, and its eyes were empty. It was a new soul, part of what had become the snow elf. It began walking through the snow, leaving dark traces on the white blanket. It was as empty and dead as all those who had fallen into this trap. And when winter came again, the town of Leah, which had become just a shadow of itself, once more became part of a vast dark story that endlessly repeated itself. And the snow elf, as before, remained at the heart of Leah, waiting for the next soul to become part of its endless chain. Over the years, the snow elf became something more than just a ghost drifting through the forest. Its influence spread farther than anyone could have imagined. More and more people began to notice that with each winter season, the town of Leah grew more ominous, and its boundaries began to blur. Rumors of missing people were no longer confined to the small towns around. In distant villages, people started to feel that something unusual was happening to the air, to the silence that came from the forest. And though they couldn't explain it, they already knew that with each passing year, not only the land darkened, but their very souls did too. Meanwhile, the snow elf itself began to change its tactics. It no longer waited for people to come to the forest. It was no longer just a terrifying legend, it was present everywhere there was cold, where snow lay. It existed in dreams, in illusions, in the dark corners of every room, in every hidden part of life. One night in the town of Leah, something occurred that even the locals couldn't understand. On the night when the snow covered the ground once more, a new terrifying phenomenon appeared in the center of the town. People at home began to hear voices. At first, they seemed to echo from the windows, then from the mirrors, and eventually from their very minds. It wasn't just a voice. It was the voice of the snow elf, echoing in every heart. Those who heard its voice began to change irreversibly. They were no longer who they had been before. There was emptiness in their eyes, and even their bodies began to slow down, as if freezing. Their movements became mechanical, their gazes vacant. They no longer belonged to themselves. They had become part of what they feared, the snow elf. There was a special couple, Eliza and Thomas, who decided to flee from Leah when these terrifying events began to unfold. They understood that this could not be fought, and that the only solution was to run, to leave everything behind. They ventured through the forest, hoping they might be able to escape the fate that had befallen everyone else. But as soon as they stepped onto the snow-covered ground, they felt a change. The snow beneath their feet was no longer solid, it began to move like something alive. It slowly rose, freezing their legs, holding them back with every step. The snow elf wouldn't let them leave. It was everywhere, in every snowflake, in every gust of wind. Eliza tried to scream, but her voice died in the air, swallowed by the endless cold that surrounded them. Thomas looked at her with fear in his eyes, but he could no longer move. Their movements slowed further. Their bodies began to transform into ice sculptures. And then, once again, the snow elf appeared. It stood before them, its eyes darker than the night itself, and its hands were like the wind, freezing every movement. It stretched out its hand, and everything between it and Eliza turned into a frozen field. They were no longer human. They had become part of the landscape, part of its dark power. The town of Lisa remained still, but its existence was no longer real. It was a place where death and life had merged into a single cycle. And anyone who dared enter was no longer merely alive. They became part of the cold that enveloped this town, like the deadly hand of the elf. And the snow elf, as always, waited. It wasn't in a hurry. It simply remained in its kingdom, amidst the snow and shadows, and when the next winter evening came, it began its next game. It was eternal. And as it waited, its shadow grew. It grew not only in the depths of Lisa but in every soul teetering on the brink of sinking into its cold embrace. And this cycle continued. It lasted longer than time, longer than any one person, and all that remained was the fear that would never let go. The winter forest was eternal, just like the shadows that lived within it. The snow elf did not merely exist, he was the very essence of this world, like the nature that embraced every living step. He was not only the spirit of the forest, but its dark soul. Those who entered his realm vanished without a trace, turning to ice and snow, becoming part of the endless cold that covered all that lived. As he had many years ago, the snow elf sat on his snow-covered throne, made of ice shards with which he transformed his victims. His eyes were like two black holes, devouring all light. He was tired, but content. All these years he had waited, and every disappearance, every person who dared enter the forest, became another part of his power. But sometimes, even immortal beings may encounter something that makes them reflect. And that's exactly what happened. The leaves that fell to the ground became something new and unusual. In the very heart of the forest, another shadow appeared. It wasn't part of his realm. It wasn't frozen, it wasn't part of these dark forces. It was a human. A woman. Her name was Leah. She wasn't from the forest. She came from another world, from another time, but in her eyes burned the same fire that once lived in the heart of every person who tried to challenge the snow elf. Leah was not afraid. She did not run. She walked to the very heart of the forest, to the place where the snow elf ruled his dark empire. Step by step, she approached his throne, not feeling the cold that gripped her skin. Her face was calm, her eyes determined. She was not simply one of those seeking salvation. She was here with one purpose: to destroy the snow elf and free the souls he held in his icy embrace. "You will not escape," the elf said, his voice frightening even the trees that trembled from the cold. "You think you can destroy me? I am part of this world. I am its deadly shadow, and all who come become part of me." But Leah was not scared. She took a step forward, feeling how the cold tried to take over her body, but she was stronger. She had no weapon. Her strength was in her will, in her determination. She gathered all the energy she could within herself. "You do not understand," she replied. "I did not come to flee. I came to take back everything you have stolen. I came to take the souls." Her words were not just a cry, it was an oath she made to all those who had perished in the forest. All their spirits were with her now, in her heart, in her soul. And when she uttered these words, everything changed. The snow elf, who had been powerful and unshakable, realized that his power was no longer limitless. Leah raised her hand, and light gathered in her palm. It was not warm light, but it was strong and blazing, like pure essence. And this light exploded, shattering the ice around them, cutting through the darkness. The elf screamed. It was not the cry of a creature afraid of death. It was the cry of one who realized his time had come. The entire forest began to tremble. The snow covering the ground started to melt. The glow Leah had gathered dissolved the darkness, and with every step she took toward the elf, the forest changed. The ice walls cracked, the earth was reborn. The souls that had wandered in this eternal cold began to free themselves, rising like cold stars that scattered the night. And then, when the last piece of ice melted and the darkness left this place, the snow elf disappeared. He was not killed, not destroyed. He was only pushed away. His dark shadow fled into the depths of the forest, where it hid, waiting for new souls. But his power was no longer as it once had been. Leah looked at this with understanding and sadness. She hadn't won completely. The snow elf was still alive. But she had given hope. She had given a chance. The forest and the town of Lisa were no longer cursed, but they remained on the edge between two worlds. The myths didn't end, but they were no longer dark and terrifying. This was a story of struggle and of those who sought light even in the darkest places. And Leah left the forest, knowing she had done all she could. She was not a heroine. She was simply a human. And perhaps in her actions, there was something more than just a desire for victory. The snow elf remained in the shadows, and with each passing year, the winter winds carried his story. But now, with every step, he became only a shadow, and the light that Leah brought shone even in the darkest corners of the forest. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.